Hey everybody, so as you saw in the last tutorial, we have laid out the bottom row of our grid and we've set all our squares to the correct width. That's really great. So now we can build the rest of our grid. So how do we do that? Well, this whole game functions here successfully draws one row of our grid. So what we want to do is, after this is done drawing the row, we want it to proceed to the next row. And notice the if question there. If it's done drawing the row, then we can go to the next row. That means we need to create a rule. If there's an if question, it's a rule. We're saying if something, then something else. So what's the if here? Well, if we're done drawing the row. Well, we know that we're done drawing the row if the current column has been incremented to the point where it's off the right edge of the screen. That means we're done drawing the row. So we can say if our current column is greater than the number of columns, then we can draw the next row. Great. Is that enough? Not quite. Because when will it ever stop? Never. It will never stop. Unless we add another condition to this rule. And we haven't needed to use this, but you see this nice little plus arrow here in the rule? If we click that, it gives us another condition. And notice when it says here, when all conditions are valid, meaning this condition has to be valid and this condition has to be valid in order for this stuff to happen. We can also say that the current row needs to be less than or equal to the number of rows. This is not going to allow it to keep drawing rows indefinitely. Just to review this one more time, this rule has two conditions, and we need them all to be valid. We need them both to be true in order for this stuff to happen. When the current column is greater than the number of columns, which means we've finished the row and we're off the right-hand edge of the screen, and the current row is less than or equal to the number of rows we want to make. So once it's done, this rule is not going to be satisfied and it will stop. So what do we do? How do we get another row out of this thing? Well, just like we incremented the current column, we can increment the current row. I'm going to collapse this loop and say our current row is equal to our current row plus 1. We've incremented the current row. And then I'm going to spawn game functions again, because game functions is our row drawing function. So I'm going to spawn actor game functions, and I'm going to spawn it in the same place, position 0, 0 relative to actor. Here we're finally using that relative to actor. 0, 0 relative to actor means in the same place as. Because this, this game function is actually a visible thing, and if we spawned it somewhere visibly on the screen, it'd actually show up as a white square. We don't want that. We want to spawn it in the same place off the screen. And we're saying spawn this. We've increased the current number of rows, so this loop is going to draw a new row of colors in the newly spawned game functions. So here's the question. What's the y position of the squares. Let's go back to this grid and say, okay, we knew how to figure out the x position. What's the y position? Well, the y position of this red square is half of the height. The y position of this green square is the height plus half of the height. The y position of this lavender square is twice the height of the square plus half the height. So it's the same simple formula that we used previously, just applied to the y coordinate as opposed to applied to the x coordinate, which is the current row times the square height plus the square height divided by 2. Okay, so it's the row number times the height of the square plus half the height of the square. And let's see if this works. It does not. Let's take a look why. Aha. And this is actually a very, very important but subtle point. As of the point that this new game functions actor is spawned, what is game.currentColumn? It's still 1 greater than the number of columns we want. So it's drawing off the right side of the screen, if drawing at all. It's not drawing at all because this loop never runs. So we need to reset the game current columns before spawning our new actor. So we're going to change attribute game current column to 0. Basically, it's a carriage return. Move back to the left edge. And there we go. Get a random grid of colors each time. I'll show you one other thing that we didn't look at in class, just because I feel like it might give a little bit more insight into randomization of colors. We're randomizing the green, the blue, and the red. But for instance, if we just set the green and the blue to a value, that's valid also. We're only randomizing the red. So what kind of grid is this going to give us? It's going to give us a random grid of red shades of red. But also, different variables can interact. So for instance, we could say, instead of randomness, we could say current column plus current row. And then what's the maximum value that could be? 5 columns and 3 rows is 8, divided by 8. And that's going to give us shades of red determined based on which column and which row things are in. From the lower left being 0, 0, so the darkest color, to the upper right being 1, 1, or not 1, 1, but 5, 4, the brightest color. So that's just a little insight into other ways in which you can determine the color of things. This, in fact, should be divided by 9, because that's the maximum value. All right, and that concludes tutorial number 2 for the grid making. And for tutorial number 3 in this series, I'm going to look at the map making and the maze making.